been instructed to stand here. Okay. Thank you for coming. This is the first, and what I hope is this first of many visits that we're going to have with curators and educators from the VMFA. I'm so delighted to introduce Jeffrey Allison, who is the educator for the Paul Mellon Collection at the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts. And he is going to give a lecture on American art, which is a show that we are borrowing from the Virginia Museum this month that's on exhibit in the Cedar Peel Gallery upstairs. So after the lecture, you might like to wander upstairs and take a little look and see. And when we're all allowed again to take a trip, we will go to the Virginia Museum and see those pieces in person. Without further ado, Mr. Jeffrey Allison.
And I've been told that I can take my mask off because I'm way up here, but before I do, I just want to make sure you notice that it says VMFA on it. So we have a lot of new bling, gift shop. It is such an honor to be here, and I am so thrilled to talk to living people. We have done a lot of Zooms and all those different computer program things over the last months at the museum, and they're all wonderful, but it's always great to see a wonderful audience like this, and to those of you who are out in TV land or may watch this later since it's being recorded. I would mention, I hope you're all VMFA members, and if you're not, you should be. And we're doing the most amazing series of programs online, and one of them, once a month, is Art and Wine. I don't know how many of you seem to all like art. I assume some of you may like wine. I certainly do. And we're pairing educators or curators who talk about works of art in the collection with one of our distributors who's just brilliant at talking about a couple of wines that match. So it might be Italian wine with works from the Italian collection, French, of course. We just did South Africa this past Friday evening, and it was remarkable, I have to say. And in January, if you still want to hear me say anything, I think it's January 8th, I'm going to talk about landscapes of Virginia and pair it with wines of Virginia. And these are hour-long, and we bring in Liz Skirpin, who is the manager of Amuse. And she shows you food pairings to go along with the wines as well. It's pretty darn fun, and you don't have to leave your home, you know? So put that in your calendar, and all you have to do is free. You just sign up, and then they send you a link to get to it. And then, of course, Sunken Cities, the wonderful exhibition of objects from Egypt from under the sea, is still running for another month or two at the museum, and we've gotten wonderful feedback on that. And we're all practicing social distancing and masking and everything else, so it's pretty darn safe to come to VMFA if you'd like to. I should also add that, you know, one of my things I'm really proud of is bringing back the Artmobile. And I curated the first exhibition, and now I've curated a second one, and it is entitled A View from Home, Landscapes of Virginia. These are not all Virginia artists. They came from all over the world to paint, photograph, and make prints of the landscape of Virginia. And it runs from, the works range from about 1845 to 2019. So it's exciting, and we have videos that go along with it. And you can visit our website and watch some of the videos, artist interviews, and documentaries on people like the photographer Winston Link. And it's pretty fun. And we're in cahoots. We're talking about figuring out how to bring the Artmobile here. And we're gonna make it happen, okay? So, and it's all authentic works of art, which is sort of the difference. What I thought we would do today is indeed talk about the works that are hanging upstairs, the reproductions anyway. And some of these artists I'm going to talk about more in depth than others. I could stand here and talk all day, but I'm not going to. Although I'll stay as long as you want me to. And I want to really encourage you to ask me questions. I don't know that I'll be able to answer them all, but we'll see what happens, right? Particularly by the end. And this first artist is Stuart Davies. And he is an interesting and a hard nut to crack. a little bit because his work spanned a lot of years and it changed over and over again. And we'll see how he's connected to another artist in the exhibition in a most unlikely way. How's that sound? Okay. One of the things I really get excited about Stuart Davis is that he really was influenced by jazz. And I love jazz. And we talk a lot about how improvisational jazz is, how it's probably as difficult to perform properly as classical music, if not more so at times, but how at its heart, it's about improvisation and the idea of players working off of one another during a performance. And he captures that a lot in works like Little Giant Still Life. And this is from 1950, just a perfect moment. When we think about jazz, we think about bebop is about that time. We think about Charlie Parker, we think about people that are coming on the scene like Art Blakey. It's a time that jazz is really exploding and it feeds into the beat writers around about that same time, starting in the late 40s. And he's really one of the first artists that's also reaching out, and we call it proto-pop. You know, it's before the pop art movement when we think of people like Andy Warhol. But he's really capturing things that originally were signboards. He's abstracting them. He's turning them on their head. They do have a certain amount of political or social statement involved in them. He was very hard-headed. And he joined many groups, but I don't think they influenced him nearly as much as he might have influenced them at times. One of the fascinating things about Davis is that during the Depression, there was the Works Project administration that Roosevelt created, and he created a giant space for art. Isn't that amazing? A President of the United States that said art is so important here during the depths of the Depression. We're going to support the arts because we know that the arts fill people's soul. And as another little commercial for the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts, of course, we opened in 1936 in the absolute depths of the Depression. And it's absolutely phenomenal that the governor who cut the ribbon, Governor Pollard, said, "We may not always be able to feed everyone's stomachs, but with this museum, we hope at times we can feed their soul." And that's what we still try to do every day. And that's why we're the State Art Museum, and we travel around all over the state and bring art, like here. Stuart Davis was one of the earliest artists to actually apply to the Works Project administration for work. At the end, there were arts all over the country, including places like Big Stone Gap, Virginia. There was a federally funded art gallery in far southwest Virginia. There was also one outside of Lynchburg in Amherst County. But his job was to create murals. And he created many, many murals. At the end of his life, he was also very influenced and became very prominent in researching Cubism. And that came back to inform his work a lot. And that's a wonderful photograph of him there with those frames around him that sort of suggests this jumbled up imagery like you see here. Next artist I want to talk about is Edward Hopper. And of course, we had a magnificent Edward Hopper exhibition at the museum last year. And, he is one of those artists you can talk about forever, but I'll try to hold back. Edward Hopper was not the easiest man to get along with. And he also didn't talk a lot. And one of my favorite things in the sort of early years of television, when there were a lot of programs that really were about the arts, taken very seriously in the early 50s, there's this wonderful interview in black and white, and he's sitting there next to his wife. And the interviewer asks these really great, in-depth questions. And Hopper will say, yes, or no. And at one point he says no, and his wife says, that's absolutely untrue, that's exactly what you're doing. So they had a very tumultuous relationship. She was a wonderful artist as well. And I don't know if you realize that his wife was so great, and she gave up her career to support him because she recognized that he was the better artist of the two. And they traveled all over the United States. You know, even though Hopper sold paintings, like many artists, he had to do other things. And he was an illustrator at first. And he took those skills of being an illustrator and created the covers for issues of Hotel Magazine and Motel Magazine, which were internal publications in those years for the industry. And so they got to travel for free and stay at all the hotels and motels all over the country. And he sketched and then would come home and then create these paintings like this one, House at Dusk from 1935, and it isn't a real place. It's a combination of all the sketches, all the things he saw, and bringing those elements to it. But it's really a great example of his work and the way we think about it. First of all, his wife was his only model. So every Edward Hopper painting you see, if there's a woman in it, it was his wife who was the model, although sometimes she looks very different. And they collaborated in that way. The other thing that we see, people often talk about the sense of loneliness in Hopper's paintings, and sometimes we talk about the American silence in his paintings and how peculiarly American his works are. They really do capture, particularly during that time period, you know, we're developing the road system, everybody's getting a car, we're more separated than we ever were before. And this is a great example of this. Again, we can think of this, is it a hotel? Back, you know, we remember that people lived in hotels. If you ever watch movies from the 30s, 40s, and 50s, people aren't just staying at a hotel for a couple of nights. People live there, and they're renting by the month. So here's this woman, and she's looking out. What is she looking at? Is she watching us walk past? Is she waiting for her husband or child to come home? It's dusk. And what do we see behind there? We see the steps leading up with the light poles, and you get the sense that it's going up into a park, don't you think? But again, I just think there's something melancholy, is a good word perhaps for it. And that's a wonderful photograph of him. And it sort of shouts out his personality, doesn't it? And what's really great is Leslie Cheek was one of the most important directors the VMFA ever had. He was there forever, and he really forged the type of museum that we would become, and that is an educational museum with collections across the world. And we have one of the finest collections in the United States. You know, we're one of the top 10 museums in the whole United States here in little old Richmond. And he wrote, and we have the letter, he wrote Edward Hopper and invited him to come and be a juror for an exhibition, and he agreed. And there are all these wonderful photographs of him spending a week in Richmond and staying at the Jefferson, and they held all these dinners and everything, and that's how we acquired the painting. Leslie always had a secondary way of collecting things from these artists, and again, it goes to show that Edward Hopper was a big name at that time, but he was happy to get the money and come to what was then a very small museum in Richmond. And of course, his most famous work is Nighthawks, 1942, and it's a great example of, as I said, this place doesn't exist. People have always gone to New York and tried to find this place. And there are places that are similar, but it is not this place. It's an amalgam. And Hopper didn't sleep very well, and he literally would ride the subway, the trains, and he would walk around all night long, and he would sketch, and he would make all these wonderful prints. And then he would do these paintings like this, and it's the most pop image in the world. It's been used in everything. There's a wonderful musician, Tom Waits, who in the 70s did a whole double album called Nighthawks at the Diner, and of course he used this image. And he has a whole song that relates to it that I think captures this sense very well. Werner Herzog did a film in the 80s that is set on a film set where the whole movie scene is based on this painting. So it's a living scene within a movie of this painting. So it's pretty fun. what do Edward Hopper and Stuart Davis have in common? They don't paint anything alike, do they? It's really, you would never put them in the same room, and yet they studied together, and they studied under Robert Henri. And Henri is sort of the core artist who influenced so many artists who came after him, and he sounds so French. But he was born in Cincinnati, Ohio. And they made up his name. His real name was Robert Henry Cozad. And his father was accused of shooting a man. And he was cleared. It was actually self-defense. He did shoot the man, but his reputation was ruined. And so they moved, and the father took a new name, and then the two children actually each took a different name and pretended to be adopted. That's pretty heavy duty, isn't it? And so Henry ended up in New York City as Robert Henri, and he was part of the Ashcan School and also part of a group known as the Ten. And he taught classes, and Hopper took them, Stuart Davis took them. They were in the classes at the same time. There were wonderful photographs of them in the same room, sketching nude models. And I just think it's a cool thing. And if you come to the VMFA, on display right now is Her Sunday Shawl by Robert Henri, 1924, which would have been about the time that Edward Hopper and Stuart Davis were both studying with him. And as you can see, his style, and this is the style he's best known for, we have a number of his works, is completely different from the other artists. So part of that whole experience is what a great painting instructor allows all of his students to leave and develop their own individual techniques and subject areas and become their true own self. Ma'am?
Did George Bellows study with him too?
Yes, George Bellows did as well. And one of the wonderful things about the American Collection at VMFA, particularly when we look at the addition of the works from the McLaughlins, now in the McLaughlin wing, is that although we had a great collection of American works, it really expanded that time period with works from the Ashcan School, American Realists, American Impressionists, and so these stories can be visually told so much better. George O'Keeffe, I know everybody loves George O'Keeffe, and it's so funny because my background is in photography, originally. I've been at the museum 24 years, and I've taught art history at a number of universities and colleges, and so I think I'm a generalist, you know? And over the last 20 years, I've certainly know more about British sporting art than more than 10 people in the world. It's a narrow study. As well as French Impressionism and Post-Impressionism, but I'm at heart a photographer. So when you say George O'Keeffe, to me, the first thing I think of, and I don't mean any disrespect, is Alfred Stieglitz. You know, my undergraduate and graduate years were spent looking at Stieglitz's photographs of George O'Keeffe and dissecting them and finding out what an incredible artist he was, how he was the person who brought this modern art movement from Europe to the United States and helped shift the center of the art world from Paris to New York. He was the first person to show Picasso in the United States, for example. And he brought together all the best writers of that time period, the most modern writers. And then he met young Georgia O'Keeffe, and she became part of all of that fabric. And, you know, she did an incredible body of work of night cityscapes in New York City that are just amazing, that we never really look at. You know, it's something, homework, is go back and look at those works by her in New York. And then, of course, Stieglitz bought her a Packard. And she went out west. And they took the back seat out, and that first season she used as a mobile studio. Can you imagine, you know, all Packards were black. Can you imagine being in Mexico, painting in the back of a black Packard? So, you know, it's no wonder she lived to be 99. She showed such a strength even then. And of course, she ends up moving to New Mexico permanently, as we'll see. But And then a marvelous portrait of her. And there we have White Iris, which was wonderfully donated to the museum. And it has a place of prominence in our American galleries, and you can certainly come and see it and enjoy it. And it really showcases all those images of flowers that she painted and how it relates to femininity and birth and all of that. And then as she moves to the West, how she starts to incorporate all of the cow skulls that we think about with Georgia O'Keeffe. But to her, cow skulls represented renewal. They're not about death. And I think that's a cool thing to know when you hear her talk. And of course, she has roots in Virginia. And I think it's so cool that the house is still there. And here's this wonderful home. And it's 1212 Workland Street in Charlottesville. So if we could all get in a bus and drive over there. And at the back of it is a B&B. So you can actually stay in it, which is kind of fun. And you can read the historical sign there, and that she taught at the University of Virginia. And I guess it was summer before last, because last summer was COVID summer. How's that possible? Last summer I went on a retreat in New Mexico, in the middle of nowhere, halfway between Santa Fe and Taos. Literally, no cell phone service, nothing. And I went up and spent a lot of time at the Georgia O'Keeffe Museum and traveled out. It was a lot of fun. And I made a lot of photographs, and the light is the light you see in her. And there she is at Ghost Ranch. That's a picture of her home, Ghost Ranch, where she spent so many years because she lived so long. And with all these wonderful young men that helped her. I was very fortunate to go out there in the late 70s, and I was a very young man. And I got to meet a lot of wonderful artists because in those days, there weren't superstars. It was very easy to meet with people. And she was scary and formidable, but also really funny and really open. And there's this great image of her starting a painting outside of Ghost Ranch in this area that she went to over and over again and painted. There we go. Mary Cassatt, The Banjo Lesson, 1894. And of course, you know, Cassatt moved to Paris. She moved to France, and she became best friends with Edgar Degas. And that's kind of fascinating because we think of Edgar Degas as being an old grump. And he was. But he was also very open. One day, I would love to be invited back to do a whole lecture on an artist named Suzanne Belladon, who not too many people know about, but the guy ended up teaching her every week for 3 years. He said, "You will come to my studio and I will teach you." And she became an incredibly successful painter in her own time. And she's also the mother of Miguel Utreo, who most people say Utrillo, but his name is actually Spanish. So, and she's intriguing, and she had affairs with Toulouse-Lautrec and Renoir. So isn't that, I'm getting you on it. Could be a good talk here. But here she is, The Banjo Lesson. And if we talk about these women who are involved in Impressionism, and we talk about someone like Cassatt, you know, she's a member of the Impressionist group. She shows with the Impressionists. She's still distinctly American, though. She comes from a wealthy family. But she's tied down in the same way that other women are who are painters, in that they paint domestic scenes, primarily. They may do some landscapes. They may do people in landscapes. But primarily, they paint what they know and what they have access to. And if you think about it, Degas could go anywhere, and he certainly did. He went to brothels, he went to bars, brasseries, you know, race courses, and of course he lurked around behind the ballet at the Paris Opera. Women could go to the opera. Women could go escorted to the racetrack. But they were really never allowed to observe contemporary, regular life the way that the men could. And so they did. They all turned their eyes inside and did beautiful, beautiful paintings like this. And so she becomes known as the painter of children. And over again, you see those images where she really treats children in a fascinating way. Because how were children thought of in the 1800s? They weren't thought, there was no concept of children as children. You were a little adult, is what you were. But if you were in a wealthy family, you were treated very nicely, although you were still thought of as a little adult. And so she really captures the sensitivity, the love between mothers and nannies in many cases, and instructors. As you can see, this is a portrait of her when she's a bit older. But she was quite a stern one, so no wonder she and Degas got along. And just several years ago, we acquired this wonderful Degas of a woman in a hat shop picking out hats. And it is Mary Cassatt trying on hats. And there's a whole series of them, and it's just, it is a slice of life, and it's beautiful. And the wonderful thing about working with the Impressionist Circle is that we know who all these people are. We know who the models are. I have a book that lists all the models. It was available to artists in the time period, and it just kept expanding and expanding. So I know which model posed for which Renoir painting. It's cool. Which is, again, how you go back to someone like Suzanne Valadon, who was his model, as well as, of course, his lover. I won't give too much more. And there is a marvelous painting by her in her American collection, and it is so symbolic, isn't it? What do you think, Fiona? And you know, it's a child picking a fruit, but that it's biblical. And when you go back and you look at so many of Cassatt's paintings, she's incorporating symbols in the way that she poses people, particularly children, that are very Christ-like. You know, and in a number of them, the baby's head will be positioned in front of a frame or a mirror so that it's got that circular halo that you see in Renaissance works. So it's just fun to dig a little deeper on some of those things. But again, come visit this painting when you can. It's just gorgeous. We'll go upstairs and visit it. Charles Carroll Coleman, Quince Blossoms from 1878. And there's a marvelous painting of him. He ended up having his own estate, and he filled it with all of these faux ancient objects. I think it's a great way. And he walked around in these robes, and he sort of looked over a group of people, his family and others, who, it was almost like it was a compound, and it was almost like a cult in a little bit of a way. But he spent his life creating these incredible pieces like this. And it's one that's great to go upstairs and see, because you can really get a sense of the fine paint detail. The brushwork on this is amazing. And he was creating these images. They're about luxury, they're about opulence, they're about 1878. What do we see in this painting? A fan, Japanese fan. Got that influence from Japan, Japismo, you know. And even having, you know, his signature there, which looks like a Japanese chalk block signature. And the newly wealthy loved them and bought them and put them in their homes. And it was a sign that you had good taste and that you were educated in art to have one of his paintings. I'm going to talk a lot about George Catlin, if you don't mind, because he's one of my favorite artists, and I've written a lot about him, and he's a hoot. And that's the first thing that should always be, if you're going to talk about an artist, they should be a hoot. Don't you agree? You know, George Catlin was born in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, but when he was a very young child, his entire family moved up to New York State out in the wilderness. They bought acreage, and they set about chopping down trees and creating what would be a wonderful farm and a great place for generations of Catlins to grow up. And he was one of the most precocious children I can imagine. And all on his own, he started keeping journals when he was a young child, and he kept them throughout his entire life, and he would draw. And he would go through these newly plowed fields and pick up objects. And it happened that this farm that was being developed was at the crossroads of two Native American trails. And so he was finding a lot of pottery, arrowheads, the things that you might imagine, and he would draw them. And then he would figure out the coordinates of where they might be. So just like a modern archaeologist, he would be laying down a measuring stick or tape and all of that. And then his entire family was there, including his grandmother and grandfather. His grandmother had been kidnapped by a tribal group when she was young, and then returned and married her Catelyn's grandfather, who was an Indian fighter in the Indian Wars. And his grandfather would tell the most extraordinary stories that I think got wilder every time he told them. But he would use these objects in his stories. And so they came like a story pouch. Native Americans would create story pouches with objects that they would use to tell stories to pass down generation to generation. And so Catelyn grew up with all of this, and there's something that's perhaps apocryphal, we don't really know. But Catelyn claims when he was 10 that he fell in the river, and that a Native American saved his life by swimming out and getting him, bringing him to shore. And so Catelyn's father said, you have to be a lawyer. That way you can run for public office, and maybe one day you'll be president. Well, there you go. Catelyn might have made a great president. Who knows, right? So he went to law school in Connecticut. There were 7 students in the entire school at that time. It was tiny. And in secret, he painted. And one of the cool things about having my job is that sometimes someone will call you up and say, we found this thing, and we're very sure it's this. Can you help us confirm it? And about 10 years ago, the law school, which is now huge, called up and said they had found this painting signed George Catlin, along with a letter from the dean of the school in the 1800s. And the letter had been sent to the parents of the student who died at school. And in the letter it says, but the fellow student, George Catlin, had painted his portrait, and we will hang it in a place of honor. Of course, when they found it, it was wrapped up, hidden behind an old boiler in the boiler room. So it's amazing that we now have it. So we've added this new Catlin to his universe, as it were. He came back to his parents' house, got married, and after 3 years said, Dad, I can't do this anymore. I hate being a lawyer, and I'm just not very good at it. And his father said something remarkable. He said, it's okay, son. You have 2 brothers. I'll make them go to law school. They'll be politicians. If you want to be a painter, though, you have to apply the same dedication that you did when you were trying to be a lawyer, and that is you have to go to school and study. And I want you to be a painter of historical figures. I want you to paint famous people, because if you paint famous people, you will become famous too. And he said, okay. So here's a great connection between Catlin and one of the other artists in this exhibition, Peale. He came down to Philadelphia and enrolled with Charles Wilson with 2 L's, Peale. You can't imagine how hard it was to get that label done correctly. They kept changing it. It looked like it was a mistake, Spell check is your enemy in art sometimes. But he studied with Charles Wilson Peale, and while he was there, he was seeing all these Native American delegations traveling through Philadelphia to and from Washington, D.C. And he also was there when the Indian Removal Act was going to be passed. Jackson, that president. And this case went all the way to the Supreme Court. And John Marshall was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. John Marshall from Virginia. Catlett, spelled very differently. Up outside of Warrington is where he was born, in the John Marshall House in Richmond. And John Marshall and the Supreme Court ruled very narrowly that this is bad. You cannot make these Native Americans move off of what has been their land forever. But the case has not been presented properly by the lawyers who were representing someone who was having them represent the Native Americans. So basically Jackson said, pay no attention to the men in the black robes. Proceed. And we have the Trail of Tears, the removable of Native Americans that splits the Cherokee tribe in two. One part goes to Oklahoma, plopped down right in the middle of another group of Native Americans who are already there ensuing in warfare. The other group escapes Georgia and moves up into Tennessee, and that's why we have Cherokee, North Carolina, and the eastern band of the Cherokee and the western band of the Cherokee. Is fascinating. And Catlin got so distraught, he really believed that one of three things was going to happen. One would be that Native Americans would leave the United States and go to Canada or Mexico. Two would be they would all assimilate into white culture. And three, they would all die. Well, none of this has happened. I'm very happy to stand here and say that, Native Americans are alive and well in the United States, and they make incredible artworks. And Friday, Saturday, and Sunday is the 4th annual Pocahontas Reframed Film Festival, which would have been held live at the VMFA. We're totally partnered with them. This year it'll be online, free. You just have to sign up and get your little ticket. And once you get your little sign-in ticket, you can watch anytime. You don't have to be there for a specific, and there'll be numerous contemporary Native American films. It's a cool thing, and it was so cool. Last year, people like Michael Horse, who is a really famous Native American actor, he was on Twin Peaks, for one thing, and numerous other luminaries. To get back to Catlin, he set out in 1830 and went out west and met William Clark of Lewis and Clark. And Clark said, sure, you can come along with me. We have this new steam-powered paddle wheel boat, and we'll go up the Missouri. And they stopped, and he would stay and paint in trading settlements or at forts. Then he came back, went back home, and said to his new wife, I'm going back, and you may not see me for a while. And the next 6 years, he traveled on and off and made numerous trips across the plains. Later in his life, he went up into the Pacific Northwest. He went down to Florida. He came to Virginia and did one of his last historical portraits, and it was for the ratification of the Constitution. And there are 100 delegates gathered together here in Richmond, including all of the living Virginians who had signed the Declaration of Independence. And that painting is at the Virginia Museum of Art and Cultural and Art, the Virginia Historical Society. And it kills me they have it and we don't, but it's cool to see there. You can look it up. And, you can see he wasn't really excited about it. The faces are very accurate, but the bodies are real small and funny looking. Here's one of his greatest works, Bada Anchendu. And here's the thing about George Catlin. He would take these canvases and paint on them with a very limited palette, and then he would travel, whether it was by canoe or with a mule. And he would travel with fur traders. Sometimes he was traveling with troops. A lot of times he was traveling with Native American groups. And he never learned to speak a word of Native American. But he spoke French. And Native Americans all in the plains and upper plains, of course, spoke French because of the fur traders and all of that. And he would roll these things up and carry them with him and show them to different tribal groups. And they say, oh, you have really captured this image of this person. It's real. It's not just a cartoon of a Native American. It's not an Indian. And they would allow him to paint them, and he recorded their names, and he recorded their histories, and those journals got thicker and thicker. And as he traveled, he became known as the medicine painter. His great reputation came out ahead of him, and people wanted to be painted by him because they knew that he was going to capture their image for their grandchildren's grandchildren, because they knew the way things were changing as we kept pushing across what would become the United States, that he was welcomed. And as he traveled, there were Native Americans who would say, well, you have to paint this person because they're really famous. This is a great person. We have to make sure you have their portrait painted. And one of them was Baden Enchendu. And Baden Enchendu is he who outrides all. He is the greatest horseman in any of the Plains groups. And by this time period, all the Plains groups depended on horse culture. You know, they hunted buffalo with horses. They fought battles with horses. And it was just essential to what they did, not like here on the East Coast with the Woodlands groups. And so he kept saying, where is he? And they said, in a week or two, we'll find him, you'll see him. Never could find him. So he settled in for a week of painting at this village, and every morning he'd get up, because he had to paint during the light. He'd get up in the morning when the light came out, he would go to the center of the village, and people would circle around and watch him paint all day. He would redo it. One day he walked out, and he could see far out on the perimeter someone on a horse just circling and sitting on their horse all day. And just the next day, that person on the horse had moved half again closer to the village, but just sat and watched him all day. And the third day, Catlin walked out, and there were many, many, many more people than had ever been there before, and the crowd had to part for him to get through. And as it parted, and he got to the center where he painted, there was Baden Enchendu in his finest regalia. And Catlin says, and the horse reared up and held the pose. All of that is true, except the horse didn't rear up and hold this pose. But it is a magnificent portrait of this man. And he is Mick Jagger, you know, he is the star. And that is all real. All the regalia that you see on him and the horse is authentic, and it is in the collection of the Peabody Essex Museum up north. And we have the honor of bringing that collection to the VMFA, and we're able to take that regalia and put it in a case right next to the painting. And then you could really go, Catlin was scientific in the way he observed things, right? And he could be a really great painter when he wanted to be. So as he gathered these things, he didn't want to sell them. He wanted to collect them. He thought the United States government would eventually take the whole collection because it was important. And the United States government didn't want it for a lot of reasons, politics. And so he created George Catlin's Indian Gallery, and he traveled. And he charged people to get in. And you'll find out how he got that idea in a moment. And short version is, he started in St. Louis, he went to Philadelphia, he went to Washington, D.C., he went to London. He said Londoners were the cheapest people, that they would only pay just so much to come in. And then he went to France, where he was hosted by Napoleon III, and all these works hung in what was the Louvre then, which was not a museum, it was a home. And then Napoleon III ran into trouble, and Catlin had 3 days to leave France. And he got all of his paintings and all of his things and put it on a boat and sailed back to the United States. And he had been borrowing enormous amounts of money. You know, he was not covering his costs. And when he got back, waiting for them at the dock, they were going to auction off all of his works individually to pay off his debts. And William Harrison, who was a wonderful industrialist from Philadelphia, bought it all. He paid off the debts and bought all of the paintings except for 2 crates. They were sort of hidden away on the ship. Catlin couldn't get off the ship because he would have been put in debtor's prison. So he sailed back to Brussels and spent 10 years recreating every painting based on his drawings, on his journals. And that second collection is called his cartoon collection. So there are paintings he made in 1834 that show up again in 1870. And they're authentic. They are Catlin's works. It's just that's what you call that. That's the term for a copy of a painting the same artist does. And here you see this, that's a picture of him. He looks very noble there, doesn't he? He looks like he should be in a movie. I think it needs to be a movie with some famous movie star playing George Catlin. Eventually he comes back under an assumed name to the United States, travels to Mexico because everybody's being told that there's gold laying on the streets, on the hills. And he makes friends and starts making new paintings again for the first time. And so when the Mellon Galleries reopen and you can come and see George Catlin, you'll see his paintings of flamingos and things like that, which are just lovely. This is one other piece, Tucci, a celebrated war chief of the Cherokees, 1834. And when Catlin made that painting, Tucci was in prison in Florida. And he had been an Army scout and interpreter. And when the Indian Removal Act took hold and that Trail of Tears started, he went back to his people to try to fight it. So he got imprisoned. Interestingly enough, after the Cherokee were settled in Oklahoma and all of these battles started, the Army had to go back in and try to separate it and calm it down. They got Tucci out of prison and he worked for the Army again. Isn't that interesting? What I love about this is it's a stereotype buster. It's a great one to teach children that not all Native Americans wear war bonnets, that some Native Americans have facial hair, that wonderful silk turban that he's wearing, which goes back to the idea that very early in European incursion into Virginia and Florida, among other places, as soon as people could get things that were more comfortable than buckskin, silk feels pretty good. It also talks about, there's turquoise in that silver necklace that he's wearing, and it reminds us there was this vast trading route across what we now call the United States between different Native American groups, and turquoise would come even to Virginia, and copper, which was mined in Virginia, would go to places like New Mexico. And so that's a fun thing to talk about. Kids learn about the Silk Road from Africa through China, and it's great to remind them that history is thousands of years old here too. So isn't that a great painting? And he's really very handsome. Eastman Johnson, Ride for Liberty. Eastman Johnson's an interesting character. He was a classically trained painter and was hired basically to travel with the Union Army to document what was going on. And he started before the Civil War broke out, painting images in Baltimore, and they're fascinating and they're much clearer than this painting. A Ride for Liberty, The Fugitive Slaves, is wonderful and remarkable because it's painted from real life. He got up one morning and looked out and he saw this scene taking place. This is the equivalent of making a photograph when something happened. And although if I take you to the museum, the guards won't let me turn the painting over because it's quite securely connected to the wall, handwritten on the back of the painting is all the information about exactly what time of day it was, the date, exactly where it was done, which was Northern Virginia, and exactly what he saw. So that's remarkable, and this is a piece of history that's also documenting history. And there's a portrait of him, looking like a lot of other 19th century painters, it seems. But I invite you to really explore some of Eastman Johnson's works, particularly those done of more domestic scenes in Baltimore. I'm not sure what his political bent was before the war. He was a Northerner. He was traveling with the Northern Army. Some of his paintings, there's one of a wonderful back of a house, and it sort of descends in order from the lady of the house down through the children, down through the slaves that were working there. And in the painting, at least, you get the impression that everybody was very well off and everybody was happy, and sort of that stereotypical thing. But I'm sure by the time he made this painting, that I think he put a lot of passion into this, and it is hard to see. You can see it better in real life upstairs. It's a child, the father, the mother, and then the mother's holding a small child and looking back over her shoulder, and they're escaping, trying to get across the Maryland line to freedom. And who knows whether they made it or not. And, it can be read as looking back to see if anybody's following them, but it can also be looked at as who have we left behind that we'll never see again. So I think it's very poignant. D. James, we don't know much about this man, really. Winter Quarters, Culpeper, 1864, but it's a good bookend with the Eastman Johnson piece, and very accurate, very self-taught, like so many artists. And to go back talking about Catlin. We really didn't have any real art schools in this country until the late 1830s at all. And most artists that you see were self-taught or had taken lessons from another individual artist. So it's a remarkable piece. And what's, I think, really fun about it is there's a photograph, same time, same place. So he got it pretty well, didn't he? And it's really fun if you go to Culpeper, you can see that down. All those things are there. The names on everything. The Army soldiers actually did that. They would decorate. And when they built these little houses, it's fascinating. They would designate different roles, and some would almost become the woman in some ways, in a stereotypical way, and they would take care of maybe cooking or the housework, keeping it clean. Other people would decorate it, you know, but they would form a unit based around traditional family roles, which helped them maintain their sanity and keep happier. The most interesting case of that is the Battle of the Crater down in Petersburg, where people were entrenched for months upon months upon months, and nobody could move. And you really get to see these incredibly strong bonds happen there. And it's so great. I mean, we have a great collection of Winslow Homers. And Winslow Homer was a Civil War correspondent and came down to Virginia and covered the Battle of the Crater. It was the first battle he'd ever gone to, so it kind of went to the worst in a way. And documented everything, and then would create drawings that were rolled up and sent to New York City, where they would be turned into woodblock prints to put in weekly magazines. And people followed the magazines, both in the North and the South. And it wasn't until 1865 he started making paintings. And his first 5 paintings have to do with the war. And one of them is Army Teamsters. And we cleaned our Army Teamsters painting several years ago and discovered new things in it, including some of these sorts of decorations or signage that people would have put on their tents. And it's some African-American Teamsters, mulesters, you know, that drove the mules. And it's a great piece. And through research at the Virginia Historical Society, I tracked down a photograph of the same guys. And it was photographed at Bermuda 100, which is right outside of Hopewell. And so that's another way of putting the history together with art. Robert Scott Duncanson, the Quarry, 1855, 1863, remarkable painter, African-American, and that just, there's something poetic, lyrical. It's a quarry, so it feels a little lonely, but just a magnificent painter. And there's a great photograph of him, and he achieved remarkable success. You know, he went to France, as one does, and that helps. Charles Willson Peale, and this is how it's all coming back together. There's a portrait of Charles Willson Peale, self-portrait, and this is his painting, William Smith and his grandson, 1788. It's a pretty darn big painting, almost as big as you see there. And William Smith was wealthy. That's how he got Willson Peale to make his portrait, and that's his grandson. And he had remarkable orchards, including peach orchards. And you see here all the trappings of someone who might have a farm and an orchard, a paring knife, you know, or a knife for working pruning knife. That's you know, the fruit, the young son, and how he's got his hand on the son's head lovingly and looking toward the future. And he became wealthy, and he ran for office and held a certain number of offices, but never rose, you know, that high. What's fake is the backdrop. You know, on the one hand, you can see the orchards back there and the cabin, but these columns, never appeared anywhere, certainly not in Pennsylvania, or Virginia for that matter, in 1788. That is artificially inserted to talk about how wealthy he is, what a high standing he has, how important he is in politics. It shouts out all those things, and a viewer of that painting at that time would instantaneously get that and so much more that he's shoving in there. And one thing to think about whenever you look at art is to put yourself in the place of someone who was living when it was made. And I don't know that we think about it that way, but then when you start to look at it and you think about the time period, you can read so much more. And it would have been common currency that everyone would have known because it was in their lifetime, it was happening. And you know, that's as true of the Renaissance as it is today with works that are created. And Charles Willson Peale, among other things, is famous. He painted more portraits of George Washington than any other artist. Isn't that fascinating? I think he painted 77 portraits of George Washington, and Washington actually sat for him live 7 times. And then he was painting and reproducing. I know I'm running over. Robert Salmon, Dismal Swamp Canal, 1830, which is, again, a very good documentary painting of what it looked like there then. And what's fascinating is one side's Virginia, one side's North Carolina. And you could drink in this tavern, and you could have a duel, and you could kill somebody and not be arrested for it, depending on which side of the river you were standing on. So there was a lot that went on there, a lot of high-level diplomacy, a lot of business planning, and a lot of skullduggery all at the same time. And it was famous. And it's now part of the Inland Waterway. And on your right, that's the way it looks today. And until COVID, a dear friend of mine, who's actually the granddaughter of Governor Pollard, I helped her start something called the Dismal Swamp Art Festival. It was every fall after the mosquitoes died outside. So hopefully that'll come back in the future as well. But look at the different forms of transportation there. And look how full this boat is that's transporting people up potentially to Chesapeake, maybe from North Carolina, you know. And in 1830, as it had been since this country was founded, their roads were horrible. We think about that image of Thomas Jefferson riding to Williamsburg that we all grew up, if we ever went and saw that old film they used to show there when we were kids, played by Charlton Heston, by the way. And no, it was, maybe you could ride a horse, you could use a small wagon or buggy, but if at all possible, people wanted to transport goods and people by waterway. It was the fastest, safest way to get there. The Scott Evans free sample, take 1. And the thing about Scott Evans, again, very briefly, sorry to run late, is that he is now best known for these Trompe l'oeil paintings like this of the nuts, and I love that take. Free sample, take 1. But he spent most of his life painting things, which is hard. You guys can see better than I can. Which again are these sort of parlor scenes of domestic women, often families, but they're not portraits. They would be sold to people who wanted a painting like this in their home, because it represented everything positive, etc. It's interesting that by the end of his life, nobody thought about that. And that was it. I did it in an hour. I'd love to try to answer any questions, or whether it's about this art or about the museum. We are reopened, as you know. We maintain 30% maximum capacity, which, as big as we are, is not really a problem. In all the galleries, that only really means much of anything in special exhibitions like Sunken Cities, and so those are time-ticketed events, so that's pretty easy as well. And I hope we'll have more exhibitions out here. And again, thank you all so much.
Any questions? Anybody have any questions?
Any questions? Now, I did hear from somebody that they appreciated some of the work that the Virginia Museum's partnership with different institutions in Virginia. I think you had mentioned that you've been to one of the museums,
Abingdon.
Abingdon? Yes.
William King Museum of Art.
Oh, Abingdon.
And when William King Museum of Art opened,
Speak for like a year.
sorry. When William King Museum of Art opened, I was teaching photography full-time at Virginia Intermont College in Bristol, which is also where I graduated from. I was the first man to go to what was originally an all-women's college, that's a whole other story. So I've sort of been working with them since the very beginning. I have photographs. It's an old school building named after a very prominent colonial person, William King. And I have the original photographs. We went in and all the old school desks and everything were tumbled and jumbled and, you know, leaking and everything. And it's turned into a museum level institution. They take shows curated by us down there, and they do outreach to an enormous swath of Southwest Virginia. It is a gorgeous, high quality, beautiful museum, and we're all so proud of it, and it allows us to do what we're supposed to do. We're the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts. We say it's your art. We're also the State Art Museum. That means it's every Virginian's art, and we want to give every Virginian the opportunity to see works of art that you own in your museum, as well as your speakers, to take workshops, to see performances. And so in a normal time period, I've got a faculty of 35 that travel all over the state, and we usually have 2 to 3 exhibitions that are traveling as well. So, and thank you all so much for your support. It's the good work, and we love doing it.